attacked the church. Paul discouraged the church. Paul was one that would kill Christians and destroy the church and do everything he could to make sure that people weren't hearing about God. And then all of a sudden, God met Paul on the Damascus Road. And in that encounter, everything changed. In that encounter, all of a sudden, Paul's name was changed from Saul to Paul. His heart was changed. His outlook on life was changed. His purpose was changed. And now all of a sudden, God uses Paul to be the one to go and preach the good news, to go and start churches, to go and share with people what it means to be a Christian. So Paul, he's now sharing in chapter 12, he's sharing about a vision that he had seen some 14 years earlier. A vision, a revelation, something that he experienced that changed his life. In the first couple verses, he's talking about whether it was in body or out of body, I don't know. And he says, I was caught up in paradise and heard inexpressible things. He's trying to explain, like, this is something that happened to me, something I saw, something I experienced some 14 years ago, but it's affected me ever since. I just haven't talked about it. In verse 5, Paul goes on to talk about how he is only going to boast about his weaknesses. Now that doesn't make sense. That doesn't make sense. We don't want people talking about our weaknesses, do we? We want to hide our weaknesses. We want people talking about what? Our strengths, the good things about ourselves. That's what we want people talking about and recognizing and seeing. We don't want them to see our weaknesses. We hide those. Yet Paul in verse 5 says, I'm going to boast about my weaknesses. In verse 7, he goes on, he says, therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. A thorn in my flesh. All right, there's probably all of us have some sort of thorn in our flesh. Don't look at your spouses. That's not where we're going. But we have something in our lives, there's something about our lives that we wish God would change. We wish God would change it, take it away, modify it. There's a thorn in our flesh. We don't know what Paul's is. We don't know if it's physical, emotional, spiritual. We don't know what Paul is referring to. But he says that there is a thorn in my flesh, and he acknowledges that God uses it. If you look at the first part of that verse, God uses it to keep him from being conceited. Paul knows that he has an issue with pride. And Paul now says, God is using this thorn of my flesh to keep me from being prideful. God is using this challenge, this trial, this situation to teach me something. Paul also recognizes that Satan uses it. Satan uses it to whisper lies. Satan uses it to discourage. And the same with us. Whatever that thorn of our flesh is, whatever that challenge is that we find ourselves going through, that pain, that trial, the situation, we find ourselves in a time where Satan continues to whisper lies to us and says, well, if God really loved you, you wouldn't be going through that. If God really cared about you, you wouldn't have that. If God was God, it would all be perfect. So Paul acknowledges that Satan uses the thorn of the flesh to torment him. God uses the thorn of the flesh to teach him. All right? We don't know what it is, but we can relate to it. So think of whatever the thorn of the flesh that you have is. Arthritis, muscle issues, depression, sinful habits, learning disability, thought life, wherever that is, whatever that thorn of the flesh is that continues to just weigh on you and torment you and bother you and discourage you, what is it? In verse 8, it says that 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it from me. How many times? 3 times. Paul says, I pleaded with the Lord to take it from me. And we can relate to that. When there's a situation in life that is just hurting us or bothering us, or it's a trial or a situation, some of you are going through right now, we plead to God. We cry out to God and say, God, would you change this situation? God, would you, if you change this, then I will. We try to bargain with God. God, if you'll just change the heart of my child. God, if you'll just remove this disease. God, if you'll just change how I look. God, if you'll change my situation at work. God, if. We cry out to God all the time. And say, God, I got this thorn in my flesh that is just irritating me and bothering me and distracting me, and would you just take it? And that's what Paul is doing. 3 times he pleads to the Lord, Lord, would you take this thorn from me? Is it wrong to plead with God? I've heard people say, well, you just got to accept life as it is. You can't change it. Why plead? Well, let me share with you another scripture. You don't have to turn there, but listen to Mark chapter 14. It says, they went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. And he took Peter and James and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. And he said to them, stay here and keep watch. Going a little further, he fell to the ground and he prayed that if possible, the hour might pass from him. Abba, Father, Jesus said, everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. See, that's a passage relating to what we've just celebrated and remembered with the Easter story about Jesus giving up his life on the cross for our salvation. When Jesus goes to the Garden of Gethsemane, he brings with him his disciples, and Jesus goes to pray. And as he is praying, he is broken, and he is troubled, and he is pleading with God, if there is any other way, God, if there's any other way to accomplish this, would you take this cup from me? But we have to remember the rest of that prayer. Jesus says, not my will, but what your will is. Not what I want. God, here's my heart's desire. Here's my struggle. Here's my challenge. Here's my thorn in my flesh. Here's what I'm dealing with. If you take that away, that'd be awesome. But God, if this is what you want, I want to do that. It's not about me. It's not about us. It's about God's plan, God's sovereignty, God's lordship in our lives. Coming back to the passage in 2 Corinthians, Paul goes on in verse 9 where he is pleading with God 3 times, God, take this from me. And God's response, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. See, Paul pleads with God to remove the thorn of the flesh. He pleads with God to change his situation 3 different times, and God responds with, my grace is sufficient. Get this. Our weakness gets to play host to the glory of God. Doesn't that excite you? Our weakness gets to play host to the glory of God. Our weaknesses get to be the platform where God gets the glory. And everyone said, yippee! No. I didn't sign up for that, Pastor. Nobody told me when I gave my heart to Jesus that I would have to go through trials, that God would use my situations for his glory. I'm not sure I'm comfortable with this idea. Yet that's what Paul's saying. Paul's saying, my weakness is God's glory. My weakness is a platform for God to hear, to be seen, and to get the glory. He goes on to say, therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecution, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am what? Strong. Paul says, I delight in weaknesses. He must have bumped his head one too many times on those shipwrecks. Because that makes no sense to me. I'm guessing that doesn't make much sense to you. I delight in weaknesses. I delight in hardships. You see, in our world, weakness equals failure. But with God, weakness equals strength. In our world, when somebody points out a weakness in our life, we look at that and says it's a failure. It is my brokenness. But with God, when somebody points out our weakness, now all of a sudden God gets the glory. When somebody points out that you can't do something, we need to celebrate because now God is the one who can do it. When there's a situation in life that we don't have the answers for, we need to celebrate that we serve a Lord who can. In our weakness, we are now strong. Our identity changes when we see ourselves as God sees us. When we're no longer defined by our weaknesses, the labels that are put on us, the labels we ourselves put on ourselves, we are no longer defined by that. We are defined that God is the one who is in control. We have to believe just like Paul believed. Our attitude has to change just like Paul's. When I am weak, then I am strong. When I am weak, then I am strong. It's countercultural to our understanding unless we have faith. It's countercultural to our understanding unless we have faith that we look at our weaknesses and our struggles and our challenges and our disabilities and our burdens as something that God can use. That's a change of our mindset. That's a change of our heart. That's a change of our life. Last Sunday, Easter Sunday, we saw the greatest example of weakness becoming strength. The weakness of Jesus dying on a cross, losing his life, now all of a sudden becomes the greatest strength that God can use to redeem us and give us hope for eternity. What a better example of weakness becoming strength. The enemy likes to whisper lies in our ears. The enemy, Satan, uses those weaknesses to discourage us and to lead us astray and to keep us pushed down. God says, let me use those weaknesses to change you. Let me change your perspective. Let me change your future. Our weaknesses cause us to lean into who Jesus is and lean into who God is. When we can't do it, we know God can. And so Paul says, therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses. I delight in insults. I delight in hardships. I delight in persecution. I delight in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Oh, church, it's one thing for us to read Paul and be like, yes, that's inspiring. It's one thing for us to be gathered here today and say, yes, when I am weak, then I am strong. Yes, God, you are the one that's going to give me strength. Yes, God, my trials and my burdens and my pains, they're all for your glory. It's a whole nother thing when we walk out these doors and we go back home, or we go back to school, or we go back into our workplace, or we go back into our neighbors. It's a whole nother thing for us to remember that perspective, that it is our weaknesses where God gets the glory. Our identity is not found in our weaknesses. Our identity is found in how God sees us. And God sees you as his child. You are the child of the King. You are a child of the Savior. You are the child of the Lord. That is who our identity is. That is who we need to proclaim. That is the label we stick on our chest. Not weak, but Christian. I am Christ's child. And that is who I am. And yes, there is life, and there are trials, and there are difficulties, and there is pain, and there is suffering, and there is temptation, and there are times when I just don't know how. We say, God, it's all yours. I give it to you. To your glory, work it out. It's a change of how we live life, of how we think, of how we interact with others. What's your identity? Who is your identity?